Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ake Festival. My name is Aisha Babalakin, and I will be moderating today's panel on navigating manhood slash personhood. With me, I have three brilliant authors. I have Musa Okwonga, who wrote a book called In the End, It Was All About Love. I have JJ Bola, who wrote a book called Mask Off, Masculinity Redefined. And I have Ijoma Mangold, who wrote a book called The German Crocodile. Today, we'll be in discussion on all sorts of themes, including masculinity, personhood, but on top of that, racism and otherization, youth, and also the journey towards finding and loving oneself. And to begin, I'd like to start on the heavier topic, otherization and racism. Ijama and Musa, you both live in Germany. You both wrote books about your life living in Germany. Ijama was born there. He's born and raised German. Musa, you moved there later in life. Musa, what made you decide to move to Berlin? How did that move shape you as a writer?
Well, I think the spontaneity of it was I was working abroad quite a lot the year before I moved here, and I kept reading the newspapers, the headlines, particular from my home country when I was abroad, and just looking at the hatred of immigrants had not really bottomed out yet, and it felt like the hatred of immigrants was coming to a head. This was 2014, so 2 years before the Brexit referendum. And I felt something unpleasant was stirring. Now, I'd studied German for my A-level, my high school. And so I felt that having German as a language in my background, it made sense to leave and try something else. And as a writer, I would say that living in Germany has transformed my career. It's transformed my career because although and I'm sure a German will talk about racism in Germany, of course, it's a profound issue. One thing I found here was, given my privileged education and the background I have and all the rest of it, the benefits of living in Germany outweigh the disadvantages. So the creative openness of the people around me, the spontaneity, some of the conversations, the serendipities you get in a city like this, city of this size, I was really lucky. So yeah, it's been incredible. It's been incredible being here.
Your book pretty much convinced me to go and visit. I've never been. Yeah, I was actually supposed to run a marathon there yesterday, and then I chickened out because I wasn't ready. But reading your book really convinced me to go and visit. And before we started this conversation, you were actually talking about the results of the German election.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any opinions on this, but Musa said that he had cause for hope after the results of the election.
I would just say this: like the far right in 2000. The reason I say that and hope, and I want to be conservative in that estimation. The results, the early results, are not as progressive as I would like. Having said that, if I look at where we were in 2017 in relation to where the far right was surging all over Europe, I really feel like this gives us an opportunity to move on from here, as opposed to the 2017. If you'd said to me that the leading party would not be the CDU, the leading party would be in a position to make some kind of more progressive alliance, I would have taken that. So from that context, 4 years ago, where we are now, I feel a greater sense of optimism than I did 4 years ago, if that's fair.
That's positive. Ijoma, how about you? Do you feel as optimistic?
Generally, I'm a realistic guy, and I don't like to mix up visions and dreams with politics. Therefore, I'm quite happy with this result because it shows that Germany is still a very stable and centrist country, and that is more than other countries nowadays have to offer in a way. So being in the middle of Europe, this kind of stabilization, a good fundament for European policy. The parties on the far right and on the far left are quite weaker than they were 4 years ago. They never were very strong, in my opinion. But we don't, like the United States, who has to face this very strong polarization of society. Sometimes we Germans were afraid that we suffer the same fate or destination, but it is not the case. We are not a polarized society. We are quite a centrist society, I would say.
I mean, that's good to hear. But just kind of drawing back to the themes of this panel, on manhood and personhood, do you find as a German that there are differences in the way masculinity is perceived in Germany versus in other countries, for example, the UK? I'm sure Musa has been able to draw comparisons on both.
I think we have a cultural change worldwide, at least in the Western world, which defines masculinity in a new way. If we think about like the woke movement, the main perspective on masculinity is like toxic masculinity, and this idea is spread throughout all the Western societies. So there is a big change, of course. Even I'm born 71. Even my generation is considered being old generation because we are not woke enough to fulfill the ideas of the contemporary idea of manhood. So there is big change, and it's interesting to observe it. I think the new ideas about what does it mean to be a man, they don't differ very much from country to country, because culturally and also politically we are quite the same, at least in the Western world, I would say. In Germany is a country who is imitating everything that is coming from the United States. All political and cultural debates that started in the United States, you can be sure 4 years later they arrive here.
Musa, would you agree?
We have the same thing in the UK, though. We tend to just take so much cultural cue from the US. I think that in relation to masculinity, what it means to be a man, I think that's just the ongoing conversation, isn't it? It's the ongoing conversation of the last decade, a century, millennia. Like, I think the role of masculinity has been evolving for like a very, very long time. And I think these conversations I think they're useful only because the world keeps evolving, right? Like, if you look at the challenges we're facing, primarily the ecological challenge, you look at, like, in Germany just now, we had the horrifying floods that killed dozens of people. We're going to need to adapt a lot of conceptions of ourselves in order to meet the evolving challenges. So I don't think a conversation about evolving masculinity is unwelcome at this point, I guess.
And JJ, to bring you in, your book is less of a memoir and more of a breakdown of masculinity and patriarchy as it exists today. How do you think these conversations are evolving since the publication of your book? Have you found that the conversations are different in different countries, or, as Ijoma and Musa say, is it all quite the same, especially in the Western world?
I think there's definitely overlaps where in different parts of the world and in different countries. Luckily, my book was translated into 5 languages, and there's definitely very common themes, very common issues that we are all dealing with in terms of like a patriarchal society or in terms of masculinity. But I think there are also quite large nuances in terms of specific issues that are happening in each territory. So whether it's like gender-based violence in one part of the world or homophobia in another part of the world, these are still kind of like issues that encompassing like the theme of masculinity. And I think one thing that I've particularly noticed is the platforms that these conversations are being had on. So it's like some of it are on social media, Twitter, TikTok, and so forth, and some of it around the dinner table. And I get messages quite often telling me about, like, people telling me about their experiences in relation to the book, no matter where they're from. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, that's good. It's funny that you mentioned TikTok. It's actually become quite an educational platform. I found, at least. I joined it last month and it's been quite fun. Ijoma, your book is called The German Crocodile, and it's about your experiences living as a Black man in Germany. I know that the book was originally published in German, and then it was actually republished in English just this year. Have you noticed any differences in reactions between audiences? Anything that you've picked up?
No, actually, the book is coming out 1st of October, so it's too early.
Oh, I have a sneak copy then.
Yeah, exactly. So it's too early to have different reactions. But of course, I'm very much looking forward, because this is something that interests me very much. I think the experience I'm describing, like growing up as a Black person in a predominantly white society, is, in terms of literature or books, a very common genre in UK or of course in the United States, not that much in Germany. And because Germany traditionally was a much more homogeneous society, therefore my own biography is in a way quite singular for that time in the 70s, in the 80s. And like, imagine this, the place I grew up was a small city of 10,000 people. There, I was the only African German guy in that city. This narrative for Germany is somehow, I would say, a new one and an interesting one. I wonder how the reactions, for instance, in UK are, because England is a society who had all these experiences in a very stronger way in the last 40 years. So, but I hope I give a new perspective to it, because if I should describe my situation as a child, I was a black child without a community, and that's a big difference. If you don't have a black community, you are not influenced by them at all. You are just an individual, for the better or the worse, but it's a different experience. You are not part of a common narrative. You just you have to invent your own story for yourself, because there's no one else who can share your personal experience with you. And I think that was one of the main characteristics, I would say, in my childhood. And it has changed now, of course, because now Germany is much more heterogeneous. So I know a lot of people with similar experiences, and we can share them. And of course, that makes something with you.
And I definitely think kind of sharing and talking about these experiences help people understand a bit more, people who aren't Black or who aren't within the community. There's a section within your book, if you don't mind me reading it, I'll try to keep my eyes above level. This is on page 161, and it has to do with you encountering racism. And you wrote, "I had never felt like a stranger in my own country. I had always felt I was in safe hands. Or was I kidding myself? Was I imperceptive to the marginalization I had encountered out of a desire for harmony? Had I suppressed unpleasant experiences in order to be able to live a happy life? Did I simply not want to perceive racism out of fear of bursting the bubble of my own contentment?" And that is something I can imagine a lot of mixed race people might feel in a homogeneous society. Could you expand on that, on those feelings, and what came to your what conclusion you came to after that chapter?
What I wrote there in that chapter, I really mean it. Those self-doubts, they are serious. I swear to God, I have not made really racist experience in my childhood or in my youth. When I went to kindergarten, when I went to to school, or to high school, elementary school or high school, and further on during university time, I never, beside of very small, difficult to catch things, I never had the feeling of being discriminated in any way. Maybe the other way around, people were always very curious, and they always opened every door for me, because they thought, interesting guy, he looks different than everybody else, we want to know something about him. But then, like in the last 20 years ago, I don't know, the public discourse changed, and I realized that all my German fellows, they wanted me to tell them racist stories. They wanted me to tell them how racist they are. And they, in a way, I was irritated, because in a way they were enjoying if I addressed stories of discrimination to them, because at that moment they could feel better than the other Germans, the bad ones, the mean ones, the racist ones, because they were the ones who listened to me. And then I always said, sorry, I can't surf with it. I don't have any terrible stories of racism to tell. And then very often their reaction was, that cannot be the case. Maybe you are not seeing it. Maybe you are, I don't know the English word, verdrängen. There's Sigmund Freud had this phrase for something that is not in your conscious.
You're put suppressing it, sort of.
Yeah, suppressing. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. They were suspicious that they had the suspicion that I was suppressing mean or negative experiences just in order to feel fine in Germany. And that was that question I took very seriously. And in a way, I know my soul is very optimistic. All my friends, all the people around me, they are much more apocalyptic than me. They always see the darkest things. They are convinced the world, because of climate change, will not exist in 50 years. And they are convinced the whole society is fundamentally racist. It's not my experience. Maybe it has something to do with my temperature, with my nature. I don't know. Anyway, The German Crocodile was the attempt to tell about a challenging childhood, because looking different from everybody else is always challenging. But it wasn't a negative experience. It was it was a psychologically interesting experience who made me to the person I am. But it was not a story of suffering, of discrimination, and of injustice.
I mean, that's a very lucky experience to have. I know, Musa, when you moved to Berlin,
Yeah.
in your book, you have a chapter I found hilarious, and then it made me quite sad. It's called "How to Play the Race Card in 12 Easy Steps."
Yeah.
And it ranges from funny things like, when you go through customs, don't act cocky, act quite sad, because, cocky people are the ones that they'll suspect of smuggling drugs.
Yeah.
But then at the very end, you write, start wearing brighter colors. Each time you're smiling and vibrant in a place that would rather see you dull and invisible, you will grow in hope. So you have to keep pushing, keep loving. And actually, I was wearing a black shirt this morning for this interview, and it's the reason I changed to this pink, because I really like that line.
Yeah.
I'm so happy. So for you, I noticed in your experiences of the racism, they were also quite gendered as well. Like, I would try and put myself in your position and realize, a white person might think those things, but they might not say it out loud to me, but they might say it to a black man. Do you find that as well with your black friends in Germany or even across Europe?
Well, a strange thing happened, actually, the time I arrived in Berlin. So that 1 million refugees arrived from Syria. We had this situation where there was an assault by several people of sort of foreign heritage at New Year's in Cologne. So there was this whole surge of like animosity towards people who looked different. And the way that I see racism is always like, it's not a uniform thing. So it doesn't happen in every town, every place, right? At the same time, you get like some places are really peaceful for long periods, and then like it spikes. So the book that I wrote was written around a period where several friends of mine, they were all dark-skinned people of African heritage, got like physically attacked in the street. So one friend of mine, he's now passed away, Binyavanga Wainaina, got beaten up by his taxi driver in Charlottenburg. Got beaten up by his taxi driver. Another friend of mine got pushed off her bike into traffic by an elderly white woman who was racist, and she's now left Berlin. Another friend was on a train and she gets showed SS tattoos by someone on the train. I got physically, I guess, harassed, attacked by 2 racist white women near Warschauer Strasse. And this all happened in the same 6-month period. But now, 4 years later, those same environments are much more peaceful. And there was also a friend of mine who's a friend's son was beaten almost to death at Eberswalder Strasse, got kicked in the head, got a fractured skull. So this all happened. This was all like racially motivated violence in about 6 months. And then it kind of died down again. And this was, I would say it wasn't gendered. It was happening to men and women, but it was a very short period of time. And the thing I concluded is because the far right at a particular point was surging in relation to people that looked a very particular way. Does that make sense? So I think if I've been living in a different, if I've been living in like Heidelberg or Würzburg or Bayreuth, I think it would have been different. But because I was specifically here at this point in history, I think the racism like spiked. And now if you go outside now, it's died down again. But that's how it was for that period in time, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And you can see it when you read the book. You can see how it affected you, affected your dreams, affected the way you thought. Now, JJ, your book is called Masculinity Redefined, Mask Off. Why did you think it was important to publish this book, to do the research that you did? Is it, people like us in the room who always love to talk about this stuff? Is it young people? Is it people of African descent?
In terms of actually writing this book, the subject matter is something that I've always kind of been interested for a long time. I studied sociology and psychology at high school level and then at university as well. So the subject itself is something I've always been interested in. I've written about it in my poetry very early on. So when this opportunity came about, it just felt right because it's always something that I've been passionate about, and I had so many thoughts in my head about it already. I thought it's about time to put it onto paper. But in terms of like the target audience, so it's interesting because I try to present things in a new way, with different perspective, perhaps. And sometimes, like, for me, my main target audience was young people or people who may not necessarily be having this conversation. Because I feel like, you know, amongst people who are already interested in this subject matter, like, we kind of already know generally the same thing, more or less. But I wanted to present in a way that's not intimidating for someone who's reading about these issues for the first time, and also that's in a way quite nuanced, so that, you know, they don't have to feel like they're doing everything wrong. Like, you know, we're all always learning about, you know, the subject of masculinity and patriarchy and gender issues. And so, yeah, like, I try to do that just by adding as many colloquial, informal stories, by music references and so forth. And I think that for first time readers, like, it's been quite a relatable thing that, like, a lot of people have been able to connect with it, because of how simply it's written.
Yeah, I would agree. I read it and thought, oh, I should give this to my little cousin. He would really enjoy this. He's about 16, but he cares about topics like these. But specifically because, you know, we're at Ake Festival, which is targeted at Africans. Do
Yeah.
you think that the majority of your audience are Africans and people of African descent? Are you worried that, you know, we might be speaking in an echo chamber?
That's a good question. I think that because if you read the book, I include so much of my own kind of like Congolese upbringing and references, like the issue of holding hands, you know, in my cultures, Congolese and generally across Africa and Nigeria, I mean, for example, as well. It's quite normal for men to hold hands as a sign of like friendship, brotherhood, affection, etc. And that's not sexualized in the way that it is in the West, for instance. But in the West, like in London, if I was to do that, that would just not be taken really kind of like openly in the same way, or would have different associations with it. And I think that because I include so much of my own upbringings culturally as well, in terms of my Congolese background, and I contrast that with my experience growing up in the UK. So as a Congolese man, you know, we dress quite colorfully, we dance flamboyantly, and we really take care of our appearance. These aren't things that are expected of you as a man in Western society, you know. So those are things that's perhaps kind of associated more with, I don't know, like your sexuality, perhaps, in the Western sense. And so there's all these nuances, and I try to make it inclusive, for an African audience, because I am an African person. I'm like an African man, so that's my center. That's where I write from. The only problem I would say is that, obviously, and this is a larger scale issue in terms of publishing, that it's been difficult getting it out onto the continent, especially from when it was published. COVID happened about 6 months later, so any kind of festivals, etc., that we would have been able to go to wasn't really able to happen. But I think that it's reaching people in the right places.
I'd love to expand that question to all three of you, actually, Musa and Ijama included. Do you think that your books are reaching the African continent in the way that you would like it to? Or do you have any suggestions or routes we may take apart from coming to something like Ake Festival?
In my case, I guess those are two very different audiences. Like people like me, African Germans, they've read that book. They have sometimes similar experiences, sometimes totally different, but they know the world I'm describing. At the same time, the German crocodile also playing in Nigeria. It's only one chapter, but a very important chapter, because I grew up without my father. My father studied in Heidelberg medicine, and when I was 1 year old, he went back to Nigeria, and we had no contact. And when I was 22, only when I was 22, a letter reached me by him, and he invited me to visit him in Nigeria and to meet his, or now my family, my sisters. The eldest sister, Ikona, studied at that time already also medicine in Heidelberg. And so I traveled to Nigeria when I was 23-year old, and it was a completely strange country to me. I didn't know anything about it. I had no Nigerian influence in my childhood and in my youth. It was completely new. But at the same time, it was in a way very familiar, very close, because all the people there, they were welcoming me so heartful, because of course, I was the
You're
son of
coming
the
home.
father.
You're
And
coming home.
this is a special experience, a mixture of distance and closeness that is quite interesting. And my Nigerian family couldn't read my memoir because they don't read German. So the translation now is the first possibility for them to check out what I wrote about this Nigerian experience.
Okay. And Musa, how about you?
I feel like, I mean, I'm on a small publisher, Rough Trade Books. They've done an amazing job getting things out there. I think it's just a question of distribution. Like, the last third of the book is set in Uganda, actually, so there'll be some interest in it from that perspective. But I'm quite relaxed about it. Like, I'm not too bothered about it reaching audiences at a particular speed, because I think it's the kind of book where it will just keep on traveling. I already know for a fact that people from the community, Uganda community, have picked it up. So if they just keep sharing it like one at a time, two at a time, then it'll be fine. It will find the audience. But I think I was very keen with this book not to be speaking as if I'm talking about the kind of the Ugandan experience, right? This is like very much what British Ugandan, I suppose, Ugandan heritage, grew up in Britain, living in Germany now, and very much like, you know, part of life here now. And I guess I wanted it to be more of a story of a newcomer to an area than specifically a kind of African story, because I'm always, I know we're having this conversation now, I'm always very wary of trying to speak for a particular Ugandan experience where I've never lived there, you know, if that makes sense.
Well, that does make sense. And, you know, as writers, I feel that sometimes there's a pressure on you to kind of change the world with everything you write. But I appreciate that all three of you are looking at it as a sort of long-term thing where, you know, it might progress in a certain way, but in the end, it's your story. Now, JJ.
Sorry.
Oh, yes. No, please continue.
I'm just saying I've never felt any pressure to, when it comes to books, I don't feel pressure to speak for people. And that's really important. I think early in my career, maybe I was like, oh, should I write about X, Y, Z? But now I'm just like, I just write what I feel I have to, which is very liberating.
For JJ, I wanted to ask him because, you know, in reading his book, he also touched on that intersection of masculinity and its role in kind of domestic and national terrorism, and how that can kind of shape the way young men think and when they decide to, you know, carry out certain decisions to do with terrorism. And I wanted to delve into that a bit more because that's of particular interest to me. It's what I actually studied at university. And I wanted to ask if you felt, JJ, that you are seeing people talk a bit about this a bit more nowadays, or if it's still something that's not considered a major factor in people's decision to join terrorist groups.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's not, interestingly, it's not really conversation that's been factored in many of like kind of like the recent issues of terrorism around the world over, I would say, even over the last decade. Like, obviously the conversation around masculinity has progressed, but its links to perhaps terrorism or even political violence isn't linked in the same way. So for instance, I say like terrorism is on one kind of like extreme end. Say masculinity is the factor on the axis. Terrorism is on one extreme end, and then perhaps military operations are on the other end. So kind of like joining the army and so forth. And if you look at the kind of feeling that both groups give, is this desire of masculinity and bravado and manhood and so forth, that a lot of young men who perhaps may feel alienated young in life, or trying to find some kind of direction, or may also be vulnerable and exploited and impressionable, are easily pulled into these groups. It's the same kind of process that happens with gangs, for instance. And you're seeing like the increase of these at a time where more and more young men are feeling alienated and feeling kind of like lost. And so I definitely do think there needs to be like more of a conversation around that, because we're seeing obviously acts of terrorism and military occupations around the world on a large international level, but also like at a local level as well. and even right down to within the home. So I think that's definitely a conversation that we could all educate ourselves more about.
Yes, and I'm sure some people in the audience might wonder, it's a panel on masculinity. What is a woman doing, kind of moderating it? And I think I wondered the same thing at first. But when I really think about it, because my interest is in gender studies in general and feminism, in particular Islamic feminism, and what I find is like there's so much interplay between the topics themselves. And as I was reading your book and thinking about, the role of, masculinity and the end goal for your book, I wondered if you feel that the end goal really is to break down the topic to such a point where people don't feel don't feel like they have to put themselves in a box in some way to prove their manhood. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like for me, it's about liberating ourselves from these confines and limitations of like that these labels kind of force us to act. And I think that, in some ways, like compartmentalizing ideas and so forth is the ways that we understand the world. But in other ways, it is very much a limitation. And if I kind of trace things back to perhaps like my Congolese heritage, we like Congolese as in pre-colonial traditional Kingdom of Congo heritage, we see masculinity and femininity as fluid and as a part of the same body. So as much as in modern society as a man, talking about masculinity, there should also be, hopefully, if we're able to progress, a space where men and women can talk about masculinity and fluidity in both themselves and each other. And this, I think, would solve issues in terms of perhaps the transgender issue as well. So, we'd be able to understand that sexuality and gender aren't limited to spectrums, like binary spectrums. They are very much fluid and they exist in all of us. So I am as very much masculine as I am feminine. And just interestingly, maybe just like something informal, I took one of those BuzzFeed quizzes. And it was like, how masculine or feminine are you? And then I got 70% feminine.
Wait, who comes up with those quizzes?
You know what I mean? It's so arbitrary and ridiculous. But then I was like, you know what? That makes sense. But then if you compare that to how I'm read in society, people will probably see me as more masculine. And I perhaps would probably identify as more masculine. But both masculinity and femininity are fluid and exist in all of us.
I know we mentioned that, these books, they're somehow directed to young people as well. I know particularly JJ's, I feel like could be a sort of manifesto for young people who are interested in masculinity and how to break it down. Now, Ijoma, you start your memoir with a chapter on your childhood years, but it's written entirely in the third person. And then the rest of the book is in the first person. And I really wanted to know why you made that decision, why you decided to put some distance between you as the main character in the first part of the book and you as the writer. You talking about your childhood years. And then for the rest of the book, you write it as a normal memoir in the first person.
Actually, even the first chapter about my childhood originally was written in the first person. But then I reached a point of limitation when I realized autobiographical writing starts to be moving or exciting if you go to a dimension which has to do a lot with shame and with embarrassment. And to be truly honest about all the feelings of me as a child, I realized it is easier to write about that boy in the third person, because then my former me becomes something like a literary person, something like an alter ego. I'm not writing about me, I'm writing about that persona. And then I could be more radical and more honest about all the embarrassing and shameful things this boy had in his mind. I could be more radical than I would have been if I write in the first person. That was the reason. And the moment I changed the narrator perspective, a big realm of experiences opened up in front of me.
And you've literally breached my next question, which was to ask both you and Musa about, writing about yourself means also writing about your flaws and your mistakes and your challenges. And like, did you find it difficult to write about yourself in that way, to kind of examine your inner self and your childhood self as well?
I think the only thing that is interesting to me in writing is finding out something about yourself. And the premise for my writing is it is very hard to observe oneself. There's a lot of self disillusion. Is this correct? You have to excuse my my bad English. It is so hard to see something clear about yourself because you live in a bubble of illusion, and writing can be a way to see something clearer than you do in your normal life, because you get a gratification for being honest, and that's a good book.
And how about you, Musa? I know you write things that aren't memoirs as well, but do you find it really challenging to write about yourself?
Yes and no, only because the best writing is generally the writing where there's a self-examination, because that's where the good stuff comes out. And so in one way it's difficult to write, but another one, yours just write in the direction of your fear. And that sounds really pretentious. I know it sounds really pretentious, but the things generally you're most afraid about are the things that produce the best writing. So I've worked on projects before and I've been working on them at the time and going, this isn't going to be good, because I wasn't like pushing hard enough in terms of the themes and in terms of the exploration of the themes. And in each book where I've been quite nervous, and that not just books, but essays, every book or essay where I'm nervous about the response is generally better. If I'm not nervous about a project, it's not good, actually. That's like a rule, I think, at this point.
Oh, wow. JJ, would you agree? I know you're also in the process of writing a memoir as well.
I would definitely agree. Like, write the thing that scares you. Write for yourself, but write the thing that frightens you. I'm not in the process of writing a memoir. I don't know if I'll write a memoir. I don't have that kind of bravery, I have to admit. But my second novel, The Selfless Act of Breathing, is coming out later this year, so in November, and then in November in the UK. And it is, I guess, all my writing, people always kind of assume is about me because, the characters are Congolese and it's set in London or in different parts where I'm quite closely associated with. But I definitely agree with Musa and Ijoma, what's been said about, writing the thing that scares you and just being honest and going down to like your deepest, innermost core and sharing that with the world. And I think regardless, whether it's a memoir or just fiction generally, I think it's really important to be able to do that with your art. Be authentic and be genuine, and that's how people connect with you.
I'm originally, I'm a journalist, I'm a literary critic, I'm writing for a newspaper. So for me, the journey into the narrative realm was a new adventure. And at that point, writing a memoirs, writing autobiographical is for me as a journalist an easier way, because inventing figures for a novel is something I haven't learned as a journalist, but observing myself and writing about my own experiences is not that far away from a journalistic view of the world.
I mean, that makes sense. I would find it very difficult to write about myself. I find it easier to make up characters that have my similarities, but not all of my flaws. And in doing so, maybe I'm lying to myself. But I like that, you and Musa were able to put your whole selves on the page. Musa, there's point in the book where you talk about your anxiety regarding the moment you become older than your father at the time of his death. And you even speak about how you've planned for that moment and you know exactly what you're going to do. When that moment came, did that anxiety, fall off your shoulders? Like, how did you feel, if you don't mind me asking?
The anxiety ended 18 days before I passed his age. It's really wild. So this year's been an incredible year for me creatively, right? So this year I've had 3 books published. It's been an amazing year. And I've started a football podcast I'm very proud of, and that's going well. And so my career transformed. So when I wrote that book, it's weird. The book is about self-doubt and whether I've made the right creative choices. And it was weird, like almost within a few months of me finishing writing that book, my entire life transformed. And I think the final moment of peace that I found with what I had achieved in relation to my father, it came 18 days before I passed the age that he was, because he died just before his 41st birthday. And a few days before I passed his age, I got like my 3rd book deal. And at that point, I was like, I've done it. At that point, I felt like I've achieved. I felt like if my dad was alive, I would have achieved enough that he'd be like, I'm proud of what you've done. And that's a weird personal estimation, but that's how it felt. And I think, but most of the healing happened. So that was a professional healing, but the personal healing happened a bit earlier. So you see the very, very end of the book. In the end, it was all about love. Without giving anything away, that experience was based on something that part is based on an experience of mine. It was basically a homecoming. If I don't give too much away, it was basically a homecoming. And I went through that homecoming. And at that point, I was like, that's where most of the healing happened, basically. So yeah, I now feel absolutely no burden in relation to whether I've done justice to what my father might have wanted, if that makes sense.
I think that's good to hear, because even reading through the book, you can tell that it weighed heavily on your shoulders.
Yeah,
and
huge.
that the homecoming was so that's what I'm looking for. It was so helpful and fulfilling. Ijoma, you also had a homecoming in the book. You have a chapter called Nigeria, where you go back to where your father is from. It didn't, when I read it, it didn't sound as fulfilling as Musa's might have been. How, looking back on your experience in Nigeria, how did it kind of shape the writer that you are today?
I mean, the Nigerian experience then in 1993 was, to me as a young man, quite challenging, because the expectations of my family were so big, and I knew I would not fulfill these expectations. Like, I would not marry a Nigerian woman, I would not move to Nigeria, I would not continue my studies instead of in Munich in Enugu. I would not. My father was a chief in his village, and I was his only son. He had 4 daughters, so he had the expectations of me being my father's successor, and I knew this will not be the case. I knew I wanted to continue my German life, so there was some tension between my ideas about my life and the expectations of my Nigerian family. That problem solved over the years when the Nigerian part realized that I will not move to Nigeria. My other sister lived in England, so I had a non-Nigerian connection to my sister in England, and another cousin also moved to UK. So all the different connections to my family became, in a way, new, and then I could enjoy it. And now I'm very, very happy to have my Nigerian family. And it is something that is, of course, enriching my life. But when I first traveled to Nigeria, it wasn't so easy at all.
I can totally imagine that. Even someone like me, who was raised there in part, going back to Nigeria is always an overwhelming experience. But all 3 of you have described some sort of weight that you had in your childhood or in your early years that, looking at you now, you've all it's kind of been thrown off. It's been lifted. Do you think this is a path that all men kind of have to go through, whether it's stuff to do with your parents or expectations of society? Or do you think there is a future in the world where people who identify as men can just kind of live without that anxiety or without that burden? I'll direct it at JJ first, and then we'll go to Musa and then Ijoma.
I mean, that feeling of like burden and expectation, I think it's a universal feeling, but everyone definitely has. Okay. We have so many labels and expectations that are placed on us, if not from our parents initially, but from just like wider society generally, so I think that there are expectations of men, there are expectations of women, of people from all kind of backgrounds and so forth. But speaking on particularly the masculine expectations or masculinity, it's really interesting because, and I say this in my book, in that in terms of masculinity, patriarchy, we sit on a bit of a double-edged sword. So it's like, in many ways, it definitely does benefit us as men, but in many other ways, there are so many expectations of us as men that are destructive and toxic for our own well-being. And so the harder that we attempt to kind of satisfy those expectations, the more we also damage ourselves and in turn damage each other. And I think that kind of like learning about those expectations can help us to alleviate those burdens, you know, and it's not going to happen overnight. It might be a generational thing, but I really think that, you know, I look at how my dad was raised and how my grandfather was raised, and I think that's going to be very different to how hopefully, you know, like the younger generation are going to be raised. And with each generation, hopefully there's a little bit of progress.
I hope so too. Musa, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think, you know, people about toxic masculinity, the thing it was actually meant to be a sympathetic title because it was basically referring to the pressures of being a man that are so great that they're literally suffocating. Does that make sense? Like, so
yeah.
The problem is there was never going to be a phrase which was going to be acceptable. There was never going to be a way of language that talked about masculinity in a way people wouldn't feel threatened, because a lot of men felt like it was an attack on them. But I can say for a fact, like, as you know, obviously as a man, like, it's exhausting. They could have called it exhausting masculinity. People would have found that offensive. Like, but it is exhausting, like having to match all those standards, be a provider, be vulnerable, be sensitive, earn money, but also like, you know, like just there's so many things that men are meant to do. And the whole point of that concept is that it's too much, actually. Like, it's too much, it's unsustainable. You can call it unsustainable masculinity, but again, it would have sounded like it was an attack on people. It really wasn't. It was meant to make life easier for people who found it really difficult or really hard to be a man. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people, I think they quite like that. I think a lot of people like the kind of masculinity that's constructed, which is like, I'm the provider, she's the stay-at-home parent, because I think it makes things easier if roles are really clearly defined, if that makes sense. And I'm not even judging people who like clearly defined roles, because certainty is appealing, don't get me wrong. I just think that in a rapidly changing world, some of those burdens of having to evolve, no, there's burdens wherever kind of man you want to be, but I think the burdens to evolve are ultimately the more useful ones, because they're the ones that are going to get us where we need to get in the next like 10, 20, 30 years, in my opinion.
Ijoma, how about you?
I'm afraid I have no general political opinions to this subject. I can only look at it from a very personal, subjective point of view. I mean, I grew up with a lack of masculinity, which was not bad at all. I grew up only with my mother, which nowadays is a very common experience. In the 70s, it was not. I remember I could feel as a child that the other people in the city looked at us, and not in a mean way, but we were in a way exotic. A mother with a single child without father, that was nothing that fitted in any picture of the society. And I still would think for a child it's better to have both parts of parents, because of course my mother, she was a wonderful, a very strong and enriching person, and in a way the strongest relationship I had in my life. And she died 10 years ago, which was a hard break for me. But sometimes I think maybe I were a different person if I also had a father in my younger years. Could be. I don't know. The first time I experienced what it means to have a father, I realized, oh, that is a very challenging thing. He wants something from you. He has some special ideas about what you are supposed to do. And at that time, I was too old to accept any command over my life from someone else.
Well, to me, these three books actually talk a lot about giving yourself the space to, truly love yourself and to understand yourself. And I think that applies to, men, women, non-binary people, just everyone. JJ, when you write that you would like to redefine masculinity, what tools do you think society needs for that? And can this project ever be complete?
there are so many challenges to this. And obviously there are some things that are kind of beyond our everyday control. So things on the structural level in terms of like education programs in schools or funding for mental health, access to therapy, for instance, which I recommend to all men or just people in general, because I think it would be helpful. But I think the first kind of tool that we have at our disposal is education, like education and community, you know. So you might be the person in your family or your household or your community that might be educated or knowledgeable about this particular subject. Like, how do you bring it in? You know, this is a conversation that I've tried to bring it into my family and my kind of like community of friends and so forth. And I'm not gonna lie, 5-10 years ago, it was like, oh, JJ, you're always talking about this thing, oh, JJ. And now it's like, oh, your book makes sense, you know. And now, like, you know, my friends are having children and so forth, and they're like, oh, I'm really thinking about how I'm going to raise my son and how I was raised, and I don't want them to grow up with the same kind of negative experiences that I had. So hopefully this kind of education is something that's going to allow us to progress along the way. And then that change that we see on a local level can impact the structural level.
Musa, early in your book, you have a chapter entitled "Take Your Joy Where You Can." What does this mean to you, and how does one go about taking this joy? Do you feel that it's harder for men to do it than for women to do it as well?
I don't think it's necessarily harder because, well, look, I'm very privileged. Like, I don't have a lot of the responsibilities that the average person has. I don't have a desk job. I work, like, you know what I mean? I've got freedom of time. It's very easy for me. I don't have dependents. I'm very privileged and fortunate. So that's first of all. Also, it's not inherently more difficult for me. It's just that, how do I say this? My perspective is shaped so much by the fact that my dad, like I said, didn't live to the age of 41. Right? So every day that I basically live in theory is just extra time I was never expecting. Spent my entire life thinking I wouldn't live past the age of 40. So when you've had that mentality, basically every week that you get is a bonus. And also I'm someone who I've lost friends. I've lost friends at the age of 22, 18. I've lost like friends very young, right? So that perspective then makes you like aware of your mortality, and you realize how brief life is. And I'm not saying I have no worries at all. I'm saying what that's taught me is to, how do I say this? Really focus on the positives, because I've got like a friend of mine just passed away like a couple of months ago. Very good friend of mine, a brilliant lawyer who died, like his heart stopped like 2 months ago.
Sorry.
He was 40 years old. Shout out to Richard Diffenthal, and left behind 3 children, an amazing human being. And I think to myself, like, what would these friends have done if they had an extra day, just one more day to live? They'd call up a friend, they'd call up a loved one, they'd call up a family member. So every now and again, if I ever get moments of like real anxiety or darkness, I'm just like, what would your dear friends have done if they had another day? And that brings me right out of it. It's like, actually always live this, always enjoy this, always try and find the happiness where you can. And that basically affects my entire mentality.
That's a really positive way of living life. Congratulations to you for finding kind of the light in all the dark and sad times. I think that's
Thank
very
you.
useful, especially now, when every day it just seems like the same day happening over and over and over again. To wrap up this panel, I would like to ask each of you, what you would like Ake audiences to take away from your books and this panel. Are there any words of wisdom you can impart, or is there something in particular you would want the audience to know? So again, I will start with JJ, and then we'll go to Musa, and then Ijoma.
I think what I can say to Ake audience, or my African brothers and sisters in general, whether it's on the continent or the diaspora, is I think us as a people, we really have to look within and understand that the change that we want to make first, begins with the self. And that kind of transformation is always something that takes work. And I think that with this book, and just for myself generally, it is about transformation. It's about how we continue to grow and how we continue to support each other and be a community and be open as well. And I think sometimes we don't realize how open we are as a people, and how much we've actually kind of gone through and transcended over the past 500, 1,000 years, 50 years, 10 years. And so it's about growth for me. And I think we're ever growing and ever connecting, and let's just continue to do that.
Thanks. Musa, how about you?
This can sound really dramatic, but we are a literature panel. So I was working recently on a new project, and this is not for anyone that's listening, whether you're an artist or not. I was thinking to myself, how do I decide which project I want to work on next? And my answer to myself was, if you could only do one more project, let's say you were terminally ill and you had one more project you had to write, what would the project be? And that filtered out all the stuff I was half sure about. And it's a really dramatic thing to say, but my mentality is, if you're not sure what project to work on, what project would you work on if it was your last? Of any context, like whether it's a personal, it's a friendship, which friendships would you nurture if you didn't have much time left? And look at that. And that's very dramatic, I know, but that's kind of how I live life, and work back from there. And the motto that I always use in my book, in one of the passages, one of the chapters, keep loving, keep pushing. Keep loving, keep pushing. Yeah, that's my advice.
Good advice.
I'm afraid I cannot top Musa's advice. He is completely right. Could be also my advice. I don't know. I would always say it's about openness, as JJ already said. That's why writing is so exciting for me. It is always bad if your idea about yourself is too petrified, is too hard, is too unmovable, and find the point where you can learn something new about yourself, where you can invent yourself in a new way. Don't be too certain about who you are. Life is more exciting if you discover new things about yourself.
Well, thank you very much for being here today and taking the time to speak with me. I'm delighted to speak to all of you. I'm so happy. Musa, I know you're a big football podcast person. I was terrified that I'd have to say something about the football. I have nothing to say.
Don't worry, there's no pressure, no pressure. It is ridiculous. I love it, but it's a ridiculous sport, so I'll never subject people to it who don't like it.
Okay. Bye. So thank you very much. I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.